Hello and welcome to the latest webinar from Austin Data Labs. Today's webinar is all about data science optimization in the meat industry. Let me introduce your panelists today. We've got Dave Brown, our CPO and longtime meat industry veteran with extensive experience from his time at Smithfield and Farmland. Dave is being joined by Renato Akamine, leading supply chain implementation in our Brazil office. He's spent the last decade running major business optimization projects in food, steel, and the retail industry, including companies like JBS. Simon Drake, our COO, is also joining us today. He's spent the last 15 years designing and implementing data-driven revenue management models in the retail and manufacturing verticals. And lastly, I'm Leslie Poston. I'm the CMO at Austin Data Labs, and I'll be your host today. I want to kick us off with a question. Dave, I'm going to field this one to you to start. Can you talk a bit about meat companies' struggle to understand and find ways to optimize and fix their supply chain challenges?
Yeah, I can give that a whirl. As I think about that, Leslie, I really think that there's a couple things that I've noticed in the past, and I'll start off with, I think that there's one of the biggest issues around this problem is recognition of the issue itself. When I was at in the industry at Farmland and Smithfield, a lot of times what I noticed is that at the different levels within the company, there wasn't the same recognition of the issue. The folks that were doing the work, the schedulers of the plants, the salespeople, the product managers, and pricing guys, those folks knew that they had a problem, that they were dealing with a lack of information, and it was costing the company money, and it was costing them a lot of time. But as you went up the organization, it just wasn't as understood, and that makes total sense. Those folks at the top, that they're not dealing with it on a day-to-day basis. So getting that coordination and alignment within the company is a real challenge for a lot of folks, is to make sure that everyone in the company realizes that this is an issue that has a significant ROI and a cost to the company as it sets today in an industry that hasn't always seen the value from these kinds of things in the past. And the second thing is that there's a lot of times we run into a data conversation where the company will say, look, we're not ready. We don't have, our master data isn't clean. It's not great for us. And what I would say to that, and this is also from my industry time, but also from the time working here, is that you should not wait and let this data problem paralyze your company. That paralysis is really something that can be solved during the process of creating and implementing a solution like this for your company. And more importantly, it allows you to focus on the data that there is a problem with, because it comes to the fore as a solution like this is being implemented, and you can solve it in a very fast and smooth manner. Whereas if you try to say at some point, we're going to solve this data problem and then start a supply chain planning solution, oftentimes you either don't, one, or you tend to solve a lot more data problems than you actually needed to be focused on this. So those are the two I see. Simon, do you see any other issues?
I actually think you're right. Those are two of the large problems. I think that disconnect that you're talking about between kind of the people doing the job, running into problems on a day-to-day basis, kind of scrambling in Excel to make it work, and a lot of the days, day in, day out, they're going home late, but the plan gets made, it's working, and then not surprisingly, things will happen, and a mistake will be made, or the information won't be available. Bad decisions gets made, money's lost, and that's not perceived as a fault of the systems, but as a fault of the people doing it.
Oftentimes,
and I think we see a lot of the time the executive level people, they don't necessarily notice those blocking and tackling problems, and they don't necessarily think of them as important. They're more interested in some long-term value add decisions. But if you don't have the ability to kind of walk out your front door and go in the right direction, you're never going to get to where you want to go. So it's almost having the recognizing the need to solve both those problems at once. And the thing you mentioned about data, there's no company that I've worked with where they're happy with their data.
Yeah.
And it's always kind of an embarrassment. Oh, we've got this in Excel. We have this. I mean, especially I think in the meat industry, because there's so many nuances to how it works. You won't find, I think, a meat company that is fully confident in the data that they have.
Yeah, I've never met
Well,
one.
I mean, yeah. How about you, Hanata?
Yeah, I totally agree with you guys. Uh, I'm working with like proteins and beef and chicken and meat in general in Brazil for the last like 15 years, maybe. And what I've noticed here in Brazil is that first, we had a different problem here. This meat industry in Brazil was a very informal business. People didn't work with too much information. For an example, I'd like to quote here is the first meeting I've participated on one of these industries. We came up with a bunch of directors in a room, each one with a sheet in their hand with their information that they're going to what they're going to produce next week or what price they are going to charge for next week. So this was the actual information they had. So and this last 10 years, and it was one of the biggest companies in the world. So for the last 10 years, I see that this is trying, having like some development, like all these smaller beef industries or meat industry in general are investing much more in data to get at least like some spreadsheets to control their business, but they still struggle because spreadsheets have a limitation, like it's almost impossible to run like a 40 plant business with spreadsheets. It's a lot of information too. So they have this need to have this some kind of data science approach to try to help them with this uh, with this kind of situations. And what I'm seeing is that there is still some objections that exactly what like Dave said, oh, we don't have the data good enough. But if you have data good enough to work in Excel spreadsheet, probably with a data science approach, it would work better than Excel, right? So I think there is this barrier we have to try to come up with to try to break this barrier that this lack of data is a problem. It's a problem, but it's not that big problem that many of these companies think it is.
Yeah, I would even say that it's the problem that is relatively overblown by a lot of companies, and by companies I mean software companies. Um, they make it harder than it needs to be, and it's an issue that if you've got good data ingestion in a data science company, that you can get those disparate sources of data that are out there and bring them in and quickly ingest them and make them easy to manage. Those pieces, of course, that aren't required in an ERP, or if you don't want to have those in your ERP, it's a big difference between certain data science companies.
Yeah, I think that the challenge you'll run into is working with a data science company that has, or IT group organization that has the industry experience. I remember actually probably 14 or 15, maybe 14 years ago, working with Dave for the first time while I was at a prior company. He was in the industry, and just starting to realize that from an IT perspective, what I thought I knew about the industry and what seemed logical to me just didn't really pass mustard. And it's a relearning of vocabulary, understanding what's really going on, and things that may seem logical to a software person, just seeing what it really means. I think in the last 14 years working on delivering software to that industry, I would say I'm now at the point where I will sound credible, and people say in the meat industry is finally someone talking a language who understands us. And the truth is, compared to Hanato and Dave, I'm, incredibly, still a novice. And so thinking that you would try and implement software or, model the data for a meat company without that knowledge is kind of surprising to me. I mean, I'm sure you have a point on that, Dave.
Oh yeah, I can tell you that it's something that we run into a lot. When we're talking to customers, and that they say things like you just said, is like, oh man, you finally someone that can speak our language. But I view it also as a real positive, having this industry expertise in a software sense. It's a huge positive just to reduce things like mistakes, differences in that vocabulary, like you mentioned. We get faster implementations. Whenever we would have someone in the IT department, when I was in the industry, that understood the meat business a bit better, right? They'd be faster, they'd be better. And we see that same thing. You get a lot less frustration from the users and better user acceptance, because they've understood you the whole time. Whereas a lot of times when you're talking with a software engineer, it's a totally different vocabulary, and you get a lot of mistrust early on in the process. So it's a big deal. Renato, have you run into the same thing in Brazil?
Yeah, I totally agree with you guys. I've lived at both sides of the stories, right? I've been in the business side trying to hire some IT companies to optimize our business stuff, and it was very, very hard to find someone. That was how I met Simon. He was in one of these companies, and he says that he's still like a amateur in this kind of business, but he's very good at it, and he was one of the reasons that we hire the application, because the knowledge of the business was very important to us at that moment. Because, like Dave said, speaking the same language, it's very good to make it faster implementations, and with less mistakes, and they understand of the business is very important, because it's different from every other business. And you can say this to every business, but when it's a disassembly supply chain, it's a very different business.
Yeah.
So if you don't understand the essence of this business, it's difficult to implement something there. So I totally agree with you guys on that.
Yeah, the differences in the business. I mean, some of the things I would think about would be, you think raw material supply, you don't know what you're going to be getting through the door tomorrow or the next week. And when you think about, what your options are for how you're going to produce finished goods, the complexity there is just unbelievable.
Yeah, it's a huge difference. And you see that difference, I think, even more when you are working around the world, right? When you're working with all different kinds of companies all over the world, in the U.S. you don't, you have differences in supply, but you don't see the same level of difference in supply planning as you do when you go to, say, New Zealand or somewhere where they're dealing with the grass cycle, right? And in the U.S. you're seeing a lot more, supply consistency, whereas there's differences within the animals, and the weights and all of the different types of branding that you can do. But there's still supply consistency, 99% of the time. You go overseas and you see a lot more supply inconsistency, where they'll cut to half speed or shut a plant down for a couple of weeks. So they worry a lot more about the supply side. But the other thing that I've noticed about, when you're looking at overseas, and again, I'm from the U.S., so overseas for me, versus the U.S., is that you start to learn that everybody has something to offer. So, for instance, in the U.S., because we have a little bit more supply consistency, we tend to focus a lot more on the demand side. We tend to focus on, a lot of short-term stuff, the tactical day-to-day selling product in, 4 to 7 days, it's got to deliver to the customer kind of thing. Whereas overseas, you see a lot more of the long-term planning that they talk about. They still have the tactical, of course, but there's a lot more, and they tend to view that different. And I find that there's things that by seeing both of those things that we can bring to a conversation. Obviously we're not giving away, secrets here, but it's differences in the way that they're looking at things. So.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Renato, I know you've got the Brazilian side more. I mean, you and I have talked about this a lot. The difference between Brazil and the U.S. So I'll let you talk a bit about something.
The dynamic of the market is totally different between like Brazil and US, for an example. The supply chain side, the supply side, the animal side is, as you said, is totally different. So we have like 100% of occupation on the slaughter lines for this week, and next week we can have like 50% because we don't have enough animals to feed our lines here because it's 90% grass-fed animals here. So we have the grass cycle that, as you said, and the cattle producers, they don't have the pressure to sell the cattle for you. So if they keep the cattle in the grass like a few more days or a week more, it won't cost too much for him. It doesn't have the cost of the corn and there's the other stuff that we have in the grass on the feedlot. So it's all the bargain power is on the supplier side here. So it's kind of different. So there are some weeks that like the beef plant decides not to slaughter, like in some plants, because the price just doesn't fit what they need. So the dynamic of the business is totally different. So and on the sales side also is different. Like we have maybe like 90% of the volume here is sold in the spot, and only 10% sold in like 2-3 weeks ahead. So it's totally different dynamics. If you don't have this like a data science software to try that have flexibility enough to deal with these multiple environments and market dynamics, it won't fit like a business as all. One size does not fit all, right? That they're saying. So, what do you think, Simon? You've been to Brazil a little bit, and we've been to Australia and US. A lot of overseas markets.
Yeah, well, it really, in my mind, I think about the different decisions people will be making. So, it's important in Brazil to understand from the demand side how you're going to be pricing, so you can kind of add that up and understand, well, what's the value for the incremental head you're going to process, and then what's the cost of it. So you can actually start to do some analysis where you're going to be setting a threshold for how much you're willing to pay, and therefore how full the plant's going to be based on that profitability. And it's probably an interesting measure in the US, but you're not going to change how full you run your plant 2 weeks from now because you're projecting that that there isn't a favorable margin or a favorable cutout. So it's interesting the way some of the dynamics in the way the industry is set up, like you're saying, grass fed. The farmer's not paying to keep the cattle out there, and so by changing that dynamic, it changes the decisions that can be made and the information they need. Some of the decisions in the US that we've talked about, Dave, that you might be thinking about as you start to look out further. You don't have to always be in the day-to-day still.
Yeah, so this is absolutely, I think a bigger difference, particularly around the supply side versus the demand side that I was talking about. Now, every company throughout the world has to worry about both of those sides. But when you're talking to companies that are dealing with this grass cycle or inconsistent supply, they tend to really want to look at a lot more long-term planning so they can try to manage that better and understand, better. The US side, what you tend to see is a lot more focus on the tactical short-term planning side, and that's that 6 to 8 week period, right? In most companies, there's some variation there, but most of them are 6 to 8 weeks, and they're really looking at that hard. Now they might be selling further out than that, but they're not spending as much time on it. However, the long-term planning has a real benefit to both of these types of companies. And look, when I was in the industry, we spent significant amount of time forecasting what was going to happen, for the next year and doing all of that. So it's important to be able to bring those two aspects together. And this is really the most critical component between these, is that you want to be able to long-term plan in conjunction with short-term planning, with that tactical part. And it's really critical on the demand planning side, where you're essentially looking at that short-term demand plan is essentially a continuation of the long-term demand plan. That way you don't have to have your team setting down for 2 or 3 weeks trying to figure out what they're going to sell for the next year and what they're going to have. And essentially it's not a waste of time, but it's a lot of excess time that they're not, doing other things. With a system.
So Dave, how does it change?
Yeah.
How does it change for a U.S. company if they say want to expand internationally? How does that change their short and long-term planning?
So most U.S. companies are already selling internationally, and a lot of times what you'll see is if they have an international group, for instance, that if they've decided that they want to start harvesting or whatever overseas, that'll usually be an independent IOC, and that way that you get localized planning and things like that. But you see this short versus long-term planning tends to be company holistic within an IOC, but there's differences there, Leslie, and there really is. So for me, the biggest benefit of this long versus short is really about not having to do it twice, and really that long-term planning horizon helps with the short-term tactical, because you're starting to deal with things that will become problems week in and week out on a long-term horizon. So, for instance, if you had problems selling tenderloins, you might look at your next year and say, I'm only 20% sold on tenderloins, whereas maybe sirloins, I'm 80% sold. So you can start dealing with these mixed problems in a long-term way, and then it helps the short-term tactical. And that's a really critical component of that long-term, short-term planning horizons. Renato, did you run into any of that in Brazil?
Yeah, actually, when you say like short term here in Brazil, it's a very, very short term, like not 6 to 8 weeks already. It's like a very long term here, because we start the week with like maybe 10% sold. Like in the US, you enter the week like with 70 or 80% sold for that week, right? So in Brazil, we enter the week with 8% to sold yet. So when you say 6 8 weeks ahead already, it's like a long term for us. But there is a longer term than, like, more strategically. When I say longer term, like there's a trend in Brazil to try to migrate some of the sales from the commodity cuts to more branded cuts here. So to aggregate value for the business. So all of the beef, this is kind of new in Brazil, like less than 10 years, that the beef companies started to work on branding on their cuts, to make a special cut for barbecue and these some more special occasions. And they're trying all to migrate more volume from the commodity meat to this branded meat. So they do some more longer term planning to prepare the plants for that. So to start another shift, to buy the right animals that can provide a better meat to produce this kind of branded product. So they work a lot on this mix in the longer term too, in order to maybe acquire a new plant or change the shift or change the way they produce their their lines too.
Yeah.
So it's very important here, more for the strategic side too.
Yeah. The interesting thing, I mean, I think both of you talked about the benefits and the value. I think one of the hard things is always you start implementing changes, and then no matter what the change, whether it's external software or process changes within the company, and then you come back around and you say, well, how well did we do? And the trouble is nothing stays still. So you have trends in livestock, you have cyclical trends in product prices, you've got tariffs or any number of macro events can dramatically change the profitability. And so you see profitability go up or down, prices go up or down. It's hard to say that had anything to do with any improvements you put in place. So then I think measuring the value becomes a challenge, and some people just throw their hands up and don't get to that because it is difficult. But I think that whether it's process change or technology improvement and implementations, it is important to get a feeling for that value, because at the end of the day, you make decisions based on a return on investment.
Yeah.
And without that ability to have a hard number, it's difficult to embark on this whole process because it's not easy, isn't it? This isn't simple. So what have you seen either in your old lives in the industry, or some thoughts around what's a rule of thumb around what value to expect, or what are some of the ways that we can measure value in a credible manner?
Yeah. So, so I can say that when I was in the industry, one of the companies I worked for, we implemented. Let's go with a supply chain planning solution on the light side, right? It was a very light touch. It impacted a lot of what we did, but it had a lot of room for improvement. And even within that solution, we tried to clear out a lot of the chaff that you just talked about, variations within markets, variations within supply side and demand side markets. And we tried to look at various things. A couple of things that were really important to us were, in terms of improvements, were lost product that was essentially made and then had to be frozen because it didn't get sold. Those kinds of what I call orphans. Those can cost a lot of money for a company. And we saw huge improvements, in terms of not putting down as much of that orphan product, and then of course selling it at massive losses compared to what you could have sold it, when you first made it. So that was a big one. But overall, when we went through that analysis, we came to the conclusion that we had improved about 2 cents a pound across all of our fresh pork operations. I've seen similar numbers somewhere between 1 and 3 cents a pound, or what I have seen as an absolute minimum. And to be honest, this has as much to do with how good you are today or how bad you are today, as well as how complex you are today in comparison to your peers, as anything. So very highly complex, maybe even multinational type companies are going to see a bigger improvement most of the time from a solution that can handle massive amounts of complexity.
Yeah.
Because human beings can't. Simpler companies tend to be, on the lower side, that 1 to 2 cents range.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of different things here that made a very big return on investment, and I like to just tell two of them here. The first one, there is a trade-off between selling domestically, selling for domestic market, and selling to export the products here. But the export here in Brazil has a very different timing than the domestic market. The domestic market, you are selling for next week. The export, you are selling for 4 weeks ahead. So you're closing the deal now to deliver 4 to 6 weeks ahead. So all the decisions, the major companies that I've worked with, they were trying to make the decision on the export based on the current domestic market price. And this price in the domestic market is very volatile, and there's a seasonal component very important in that. So they should be seeing like 6 weeks ahead the domestic market price to make the trade-off, and not the current domestic price. And some of the predictive analysis too that I've worked with could give us this information, like how it's going to the domestic market will behave like 6 weeks from now, and you start to making decisions on the export based on what's going to happen to the domestic market. This made a huge improvement in the results of the business, because there are some times that you avoid to sell to export because the price was not right at that moment, but 4 to 6 weeks ahead it was very good. So if you don't like close that deal now, 6 weeks from now the price won't be the same. So you will lose this opportunity, this window of opportunity, and it was very uh, you would lost a lot of money. So with this kind of decision, looking like 4 6 weeks ahead, it could give you a lot of uh, money. And the other thing, it's crazy in Brazil, but it's also brings some opportunities. It's like, for an example, like the taxes in Brazil. It's a very crazy stuff. You have different taxes from depending on where you are shipping from and where you're shipping to. So, and also even within a state, you have difference between products and difference between different units, different plants, because there are some plants that it's in a very remote city that you are bringing more employers to that city, and you have like a special tax benefit there. So for each plant you can have a different tax. So this is creates like a mess, totally mess, because you have to calculate from each plant you're shipping from to every customer you're shipping to by product type. But it also creates an opportunity, because you can try to optimize your supply chain and your network to try to produce the products and ship to the most profitable locations, considering the cost to serve. So it's this is a huge opportunity in all the business that I've been to, not only in the meat size, but in every business in Brazil, but in meat, because of the high volume of the we have here. This is also creates a very big opportunity of improvement and get ROI on it.
Yeah, I have to
So it's
imagine
interesting.
that's
Before we close out, we actually have a question from the audience. I think that you answered this already, but I'm going to ask anyway because I think there's some nuance to the question that we can go into. Haresh Gurnani, listening in, hi Haresh, says that he's hearing optimization models, that we hear about them, but in practice, they can have different implications depending on the short term, medium, and longer term decision making. And he wants to know, how does this time bound decision making complicate optimization efforts in the meat industry?
So potentially, you can think about a long-term plan where you say you want to have a plan for a year, and the critical thing, and the reason why this will fail a lot, is either you're making very different assumptions, you end up with two completely different models which are disconnected, and so you have people tactically implementing one way, and the senior executives are planning in one direction, you're tactically going in a different direction, and it just creates friction. But the challenge and the reason why this is difficult is because if you want to help with a production plan for tomorrow, you need to understand a lot of details around the plant's constraints. Maybe you've got more characteristics of the livestock that have come in. And so you've got a lot more detail. As you start to get out to next week, next month, or 6 months from now, there's a lot more volatility. You've got a lot less understanding of what the livestock characteristics will be, what the demand will be. So there's what you need to do is have an optimization model that can have different time buckets and have different granularities of constraints and rules in place at each of those distinct ranges. And so as you get closer, you get a refined and better view, both because you're taking more constraints into account and because you actually know more of what's happening. I think it's reasonable to do that because there's as you have more uncertainty, there's no point in trying to solve a problem to the nearest decimal point. I don't know if that makes sense.
One example of that, right, Sam, is like for a daily planning, you have to consider like truckloads.
Yeah.
In a monthly planning, the truckload is not too necessary to consider.
Yeah.
So this is already a huge change in the model of the optimization model. It brings, just to have a truckload in the model, it brings a lot of more complexity to the model.
And that really, it's highlighting, I think, that your understanding of that, it really highlights the fact that there's the industry expertise to understand what are those cutoffs and what are the constraints you need to consider. But then you do, I mean, we've talked about the industry expertise, but there's the data science experience and knowledge where you have people who know the impact of different constraints, how to model them, how to set up time buckets and things like that, so that you can combine the understanding of what you'd like it to look like and what's the realm of possibility from a data science point of view.
I think they hit it perfect. I don't have anything to add.
Great. We're coming up on time, so let me just close it out by asking each of you to share with us what thought you'd like to leave our listeners with about optimizing in the meat industry.
I guess I can start. I think that the one thing that I would try to leave with you that we haven't touched on, it's a little different, is that oftentimes the folks that you have in a meat company that are absolutely the most knowledgeable, talented folks in the company are your production schedulers, your product managers, your pricing managers. These are critical components of a corporate environment on the sales and supply chain planning. Ask yourself the last time those folks went home early. And, those folks tend to be putting out fires all day long. They're not doing a lot of they're not doing as much as they would want to of this long-term thought process. Oftentimes they don't have time to even catch a breath. They've got so much fires that they're putting out. Bringing in a solution, a supply chain planning solution, takes them from putting out fires all day to actually planning the business. You have converted some of your most talented individuals in the company to now using those talents to improve you long term instead of just get you through a day. That's a real critical component of a solution like a supply chain planning solution.
Yeah, I can add something to this. Is like, and for more good that you can be like you can be the best planner, the best manager, the best revenue management manager. There are something that are not obvious that the data science software can bring you and take you out from your comfort zone and show you something that you cannot see, even if you're very experienced, because we have a limitation when you're working with some spreadsheets and this kind of stuff. And when you go to a lot more data science approach, you can see things that you've not seen before. So it's very important to not be resistant to what this kind of software or application can bring you and add value to your company. So I've been there. I've been in the business side, and I remember when Simon came up with a simple calculation of trade-off. It just blew my mind because I've never thought of it before, because it was not obvious to see. So I think it's why I live here, is trying to be more open at least to try and understand how can this help you in the day to day, and also bring like return on investments.
Yeah. I think I would say that we kind of looping back to the beginning, the challenges of getting started. We talked about a couple of them, but I think that there's maybe a feeling of, an overall intimidation. Like, is the data ready? Are our processes ready? Are we going to have someone come in and tell us how things should work? And I think one of the things that we've realized is, we've seen a lot of different companies. We understand the data science, but when each individual company is working in their own niche or environment, and you have, to Dave's point, you have amazing people getting their job done on a daily basis. And part of the effort here is understanding why it's being done in a certain way, and then keeping an open mind for how it can be improved. But also, the first step is us learning the nuances of what's going on and being respectful of the fact that there's a lot of learning and knowledge there. And I would say that, there are a lot of software companies who come in thinking they're the brightest people in the world and want to tell others how they should be doing their job without fully understanding it. So I think that's one fundamental difference, I'd say, in the way we think about things.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely critical. And even what you said there at the end about, not thinking we know everything about this, right? That we understand that you are a company because of what makes you special, not because of the industry that you're in, right? And a one trick pony solution doesn't work for you. And I can tell you, it's one of the most frustrating things in the world when I was in the business, having a software person tell me, you have to run your business this way because that's the way the software is built. and I'm like, no, that's not going to happen. So that's a critical component for me.
I think that's a great place to end, actually, because we're at time. But this has been fantastic. I definitely want to do another webinar with the three of you, because I think there's so much more we can talk about with this industry. You're welcome, Harash. He was thanking you for answering his question. I want to thank everyone for coming today. The recording will be up in a few hours. You will get an email automatically when it's generated. And if you come back to the recording in 2 days, I also do captions for it in both English and Portuguese that will be ready a couple of days from now. So there will be one without ready today, and then one with ready in a couple of days. Thank you all for coming. Look forward to seeing you next month. Our webinar next month is going to be with our CTO, Sushil, our data scientist, Evan, and I'm forgetting the third person, sorry, but it's going to be about data science optimization across the board for commodity agriculture industries.
Great.
Thank you, everyone.